welcome to Learn to Live Stress-Free. This is Christine Wright with Dr. Robert Wright Jr., your go-to wellness coaches of www.stressfreenow.info. Our featured guest today is Reggie Marra, speaking on grief and healing. Reggie is a certified integral master coach and a partner with Paradox Edge, a business coaching and consulting firm. He is also an educator and teaching poet. Reggie is a former teacher, basketball coach, and administrator in secondary and higher education who engages his clients with integral applications and writing as tools for alleviating unnecessary suffering throughout an exploration of identity, perspective, and purpose. Reggie has presented his poetry in workshop for the National Association for Poetry Therapy, the Transformative Language Arts Network, the National Speakers Association, the Iona Spiritual Institute, Tech Canada, and Vistage USA, among others. In 2013, Reggie released the revised edition of The Quality of Effort, which delivered a powerful message of hope filled with humanity and honest answers to questions we sometimes think about but may not want to ask ourselves. Reggie is also a certified Leadership Agility 360 coach and holds an A.C.C. credential with the International Coach Federation. Reggie, we're honored to have you again as our guest today. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Christine and Bob. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation to come back.
Yes, Reggie, it's so good to have you back, and thank you for being our featured guest, and welcome to our audience.
Reggie, you have been here before, but for those who haven't heard, could you tell us how you got to where you are doing the work you're doing now?
Sure. In 25 words or less, I began as a high school teacher and basketball coach back in the 70s, and enjoyed that, but found that I was drawn to a bigger curriculum, or wider curriculum. I had been writing since my late teens and early 20s, and I gradually set out to create my own curriculum around poetry writing as a tool for self-knowing and self-transformation. And in the mid-'90s, found Ken Wilber's work as an integral model builder, I guess I would call him. That's just horribly reductionistic, he probably saved me 10 or 20 years of work in terms of pointing to some things that made sense of what I had an inclination toward. And I've just been very fortunate moving forward to be able to find ways to integrate the poetry writing with integral coaching and just education at large as well, and the ability to just make some things up and see how they work has also played a role. So try some things out, and some of them work and some don't, and that's the risky part of stepping somewhere outside of the conventional way things are done.
Oh, thanks, Reggie.
Yeah, great. Reggie, how do you distinguish between grief and mourning?
Okay, that's in terms of getting us started. For me, grief is the felt sense, emotional sense that I feel in my body. I think that we feel in our bodies after as a result of a loss. And I would define or characterize mourning as chosen behaviors, public behaviors, not necessarily out in the town square or village green, but the publicly visible behaviors that we use, the actual rituals we use to engage our grief. So where grief might be an overwhelming sense of loss or sadness, and it could be characterized by lethargy or confusion or just deep sadness. Mourning might be what we do in terms of a memorial service for a loss, or a ritual that we enact in order to externally begin to work with or on the grief.
Reggie, that's so interesting that you would make that distinction. Since you mentioned Ken Wilber, what my mind automatically went to, and I know some people in our audience may not be familiar with Ken Wilber, but for those who are, when you gave your answer distinguishing grief and mourning, you mentioned that you saw grief as a felt sense. And so I was thinking from Wilbur Combs' matrix perspective, that would be in quadrant 1 and 2, and for the grief. And then I thought of the mourning as quadrant 3 and 4. So do you have that same perspective that it could be put into those categories?
I would, yeah. I think I would tease that apart a little bit differently, and if that's all right. I definitely agree that the grief would be, and I'll just rather, because for people who are listening that don't know what we're speaking about in terms of quadrants, I would characterize the grief as an interior individual experience. That would be the upper left quadrant. That also can have some manifestation in the upper right or the exterior, because again, there's a bodily felt sense to it. It's real. You can feel it in your body, however you hold your sadness. And then the mourning itself, depending on how it's manifested, because all these things really have aspects in all 4 quadrants. We like to say things tetra arise. And the mourning, would definitely be on the right side of the quadrant, so an exterior individual and or collective event. So if an individual decided to wear black for a year to mourn the loss of a loved one, that would be an exterior individual choice. But if an individual chose to go to a place of worship or some other location with other people to mourn, that would be more of an exterior collective or lower right quadrant event. So I try to be careful not to locate things and say this is in this quadrant only, and just really recognize that most things actually have components in all 4 quadrants.
Okay, that's great. The reason I asked you that question is that I have my own views on what bodily felt sense is what it means. We're talking about it here from the standpoint of grief. So let me ask you this question, Reggie. Do you have specific practices or approaches to healing that have served you well?
Yeah, so from a very personal perspective, and this wasn't something that this is a description of what I can look back on, as opposed to a prescription that I came up with. But in my own life, I can identify 5 approaches or practices to healing that serve me well, and I'll keep that in the present tense. So it's not, I have done them in the past, but they continue to be present. And I'll just name them, and then we can go in whatever direction serves our conversation. But basically the 5 components or activities that I have found helpful are writing, physical exercise, meditation, experiencing nature, going out into the natural world, and then the last one, is really conversation / relationship. So, write, move my body, get my body still and meditate, go out into the natural world, and then engage in, intimate, and by intimate I mean, emotionally and intellectually intimate conversation and relationship with good people. Those are 5 things that are immensely healing in my own life.
Thank you, Reggie. I'm curious, in your practice or just in your interactions, what have you found in others in terms of mourning behaviors for healing grief, as you just mentioned with your practices? Do people, when they're in grief, because sometimes, they'll be sleeping longer periods of times, they'll just be lethargic, as you said, they don't want to work, they don't want to think, they don't want to engage. So what's the movement to get you into mourning behaviors that may be healing and are mourning behaviors healing?
Yeah, that's actually a very, in my hearing that question, Christine, that's just very, very rich, and I think it's kind of multi-textured, and I think it really depends on the nature of the loss, on the personality and belief system of the survivor of the loss, of the person who is grieving and perhaps moving into mourning, if he or she comes from a specific religious tradition or not, if he or she has a support system of friends and or family or not. and how healthy, and that's kind of a really ambiguous word, what that really means, but how, say, emotionally, physically, spiritually healthy the individual is, at the time of the loss and moving forward. So I would be really hesitant to try to name, what it takes outside of the context of a specific individual and his or her life. So I'm not trying to be evasive there, but that's really my best answer to that.
That's a wonderful answer, and I thank you. And, that is complete because loss of any kind is so personal and individualistic, and there are many unique variables to each survivor on how they respond to it. So actually that was an excellent answer. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Yeah, Reggie, since grief and grieving stir up such powerful emotions, and it has the capacity to change whatever it is that you were doing, and it gets your full attention. The thing is, I like to think of it as that if a long time ago someone said to me, if you live long enough, it's guaranteed that you will grieve. So I know in my own life I've had to wrestle with grieving, the loss of my mother at an early age. So my question to you is, for you, how do you hold the concept of healing in your own life, and whether it's on the felt sense level, but conceptually, how do you hold healing?
Yeah, thanks for that question too. These are great questions, and I have to credit the language I'll use. I first came upon when I read John Kabat-Zinn's Full Catastrophe Living back in the early '90s, and because I think it's really true. I'll use language from that book that for me, healing, the primary trajectory of healing is first coming to terms with things as they are. In other words, peeling away my responses to things, how I wish things were, my desire for things to be different, my stories around what's true. To the best I can do that, and that's a real art form, as both of you know, to separate what's more or less objectively true in the world, to the extent that we can know that, from our stories about it. But really first settling into, coming to terms with what's true, whether it's just a couple of examples in my own life was, I took care of my own mom for 3.5 years, and then she passed away, and my sister took her own life. I've had a marriage ended. I had, on a more physical level, I had both my hips replaced 11 years ago. So there's different types of healing, but coming to terms with the reality of any one of those events, for me, is the first step in healing.
Wow, Reggie, you said a mouthful there. Let me just drill down a little bit, because when you were talking, the answer that you gave, what the insight that I have is what we're really talking about here are deep levels of pain and hurt, and down to the core of our being. So could you just speak a little bit to that as a coach, and also as a human being, that this thing of dealing with the deep levels of pain and hurt, what do you think is a way to approach it? Given the life experience that you have now, you can look back retrospectively, and you've gone through these very, very painful things, and you're still standing. And so the thing is to recover and then heal. And I know we've had past conversations about, is it healing recovery, or is it recovery, or is it healing? And so at the core, we were talking about pain, and I wanted your take on that.
Sure. So I'll differentiate between pain and suffering, because that's helpful for me to get clear. I think pain is what arises, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain, when we suffer a loss or an injury, and the suffering that comes along with that, and again, this is my take on it, is due to the story we have about the pain that we're undergoing or that we're experiencing. So what serves me the most in terms of, okay, I have real pain, the loss of a loved one, or the loss of a relationship, or the arthritic hips or whatever it happens to be in my case. So what is this? How do I hold that? What's the story I tell myself about this loss? And what really helps in the recovery or the healing for me, and I'm going to guess that this is, without projecting too much, true for most human beings, that the bigger space I have to hold my pain, the more inclusive a story I can tell about it, the less I'm going to suffer. So to give an example of that, some of the language that Kristen Neff, who is a researcher on self-compassion, uses, she speaks about one of the three components of self-compassion, which is really a healing component in my take, is that recognizing and remembering that I am part of this bigger common humanity, that I'm even bigger than humanity. I'm part of the universe, creation, whatever you want to call it. And within the context of the suffering around the world and on this planet, how do I hold my specific loss, knowing that other people are suffering or in pain, that they've suffered loss and are suffering loss? It's not about me and my pain. It's about the pain and my personal experience of it. So the broader perspective I'm able to hold my unique experience in, the better able I am to transcend my own pain and suffering, and then towards that and the end of healing. So I don't know if that made sense or not.
Yeah, no, I understand that, and I would say that is a great left brain answer because what I was thinking about how you were distinguishing between pain and suffering, I said, "Oh, that's so brilliant." But let me ask you this, and because I think for our audience, and I know for me personally, when you mentioned the aspect of the suffering and the story, of course that makes a lot of sense. What you said, sometimes are we going to be tied to victimhood, or are we going to be able to move on at some point? I wanted to ask you, what, from your perspective, what role does social support, play in the healing recovery process? Because I found in my own life that many people, they experience the death of a close loved one, and then people are there for them initially, and then 2 weeks or a month later, then everybody's gone, and then that's where it seems to me that the key support systems really need to kick in, because initially the person is still in one of those 5 phases of denial or numbness, etc., and so now you're a month or 2 months out, and the reality of the loss has really kicked in. The person is no longer there. They may be affected financially, etc. So could you just speak briefly, Reggie, to the role that social support, or just support in general, whether or not it's, there was a life insurance policy in place or no life insurance policy in place, the role that social supports play in this whole grieving process and then moving towards healing recovery?
Yeah, I've found that as I get older, that's one specific aspect of what you're referring to as social support becomes increasingly important to me, and that's just relationship and conversation, of being able to speak about how I feel without being judged by the listener or listeners, and whether that's in a institutionalized, in the best meaning of that word, support group, or whether it's with close friends and family members with whom I feel safe. That kind of social support I think is invaluable. Obviously, if there's financial support and an infrastructure, just to be able to take care of the basic needs, that's important too. But in my personal experience, the writing still serves, working in nature still serves, but the most valuable support that I have in my life now, and it's primarily friends and colleagues as opposed to blood family members, of people who accept me as I am, and I can go back to their wells as often as I need to, and then they know it's reciprocated. That, I think, Well, I won't project it, but I'll just say, at this point in my life, the coalition of people who accept me as I am is the most significant part of the process of healing.
Thank you, Reggie. Thank you so much. As I was listening to you, I had a light bulb moment in terms of your 5 healing practices, that to have those practices in play and up and running throughout your life, so that when these moments come, when you need that extra reserve, that extra, safe port in the storms of our lives, that you have, whether it's connecting to nature, the exercise, the meditating, the relationship. If it's not writing, then maybe it's music for some of our listeners. For that to be there really is a saving grace. And healing really is an ongoing process living in this world, because we are, subject to pain. It's part of our condition as things stand now. Reggie, the additional question that I want to ask you, when there's a loss, specifically a death, but, it can be a loss, as you said, of a marriage, of a job, of anything else. But when there's a loss of a loved one, what role does commemorating the anniversary or a birthday or holidays? This year I had 2 friends who lost close family members, and it was the first year, so there was a marking of that, of the deceased, of the lost one's birthday. How do these practices play out in healing?
Yeah, I think they're really important, and again, I'll speak personally to that. With the 3, my 3 family of origin members, my parents and my sister, I mark both their birthdays and the days of their deaths, as anniversaries. And I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but not really. But I actually use Facebook towards that with my friends on social media, but not only Facebook, to put up a photograph and say something about it. And I would also add that, and this is my experience of marking the anniversaries, be it the birth and or the death of a loved one, that it's not done with a sense of morbidity and self-flagellation and repeating a story of sadness and chagrin, but it's done in a sense of honoring the life of the person and acknowledging the sadness of the loss. But the word progressive comes to mind, and not like progressive politics, but it's a progressive healing process as I get further and further away from the actual loss, to recognize the value of the relationship and honor it, once or twice a year. And I think that's extraordinarily important. I mean, just as a short, specific example of that wasn't time-based, but at my father's funeral, at the end of the eulogy, and he was 88 when he died, and and a lot of sad people in the congregation. It was at a Catholic church, but I asked them to just stand up and clap for a life well lived, as opposed to being sad about the loss of someone they loved. And people jumped at that opportunity. So it's a perspective taking thing as well. Are we sad? Yes, but would he want us to sit around crying, or would he rather have a standing ovation? So that's just one specific example of how I tried to hold that loss.
Yes, I think that's very true. I know certainly my mother passed away 16 years ago, and I think about her every day of my life still, because she's still a part of my life, as she always will be. So to celebrate the life shared and to still remember the person, it really is a wonderful gift. And I know when I think of your sister Anne-Marie, there is sometimes some sadness, but I look at how beautiful she was, how talented she was, and the body of work that she's done that we're still able to look at. And it is a wonderful thing to celebrate the life of a person and their accomplishment. And I think we do, when we focus on that, when we keep them alive in their talent and in our love, I personally, too, have found that helpful. So, Reggie, I really want to thank you for being our guest. As always, we are honored by your presence. Reggie, would you tell our listeners how they can contact you and what you may have going on that they would be interested in?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for just mentioning Anne-Marie and for making that final comment, Christine. I appreciate that. And the easiest way is, rather than trying to remember email addresses and things, is just my name, Reggie, Reggie Marra, MARRA.com, and all of my contact information, phone and email, is available on that site. So that's the easiest way. In terms of things coming up, two things I'm really looking forward to are it's actually a local poetry reading, but it's in New Milford, Connecticut, and I'll be one of probably 10 poets and several musicians who will be reading at a charitable event for Loaves and Fishes, which is the soup kitchen in New Milford, and it's the third annual fundraiser for them using poetry and music to raise some funds. And there's one other one I'm waiting on. I won't announce that one yet because I don't know if my poetry has been accepted, but it's I'll say it's the Poets and Writers on War and Peace at the Hudson Valley Writers Center in New York, and that's their 9th annual. I've read 7 of the first 8. And that's another event that I look forward to as a poet. So those are just 2 things in the hopper right now, and just keep on trying to do good work.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Reggie. So our audience, if you want to keep up with Reggie, and if you're in the area, please check his events, and you can check his website, reggiemarra.com, ReggieMarra, reggiemarra.com, and maybe you'll be able to listen to Reggie in person and meet him.
Great. Thank you, Christine. Reggie, right before we wrap up, I just want to touch on this one point that you made that really resonated with me, and I'm having an intuitive sense that it will resonate with our audience. You mentioned safety and acceptance in the context of grieving. Can you just talk very briefly about how important that is and how that fits into what you do as a coach?
Yeah, I appreciate the question around safety and acceptance. Maslow comes to mind, but the idea of safety and security as our basic lowest level needs, and then belonging a little bit above that or after that. Whether it's in the healing process or whether it's in a coaching setting or whether it's in my work as a poetry writing instructor, one of my goals is to create a safe space within which to coach and within which to invite people to write from the deepest part of themselves. My own experience in grieving is that I'm blessed with having a circle of really close friends with whom I feel 100% safe, literally 100% safe. I can show up whether I'm being goofy or grave, whether I'm grieving or whether I'm telling jokes, and I'm not worried about their being offended or judgmental. They'll be honest with me, which I appreciate, but I know that they accept me as I am, and they know I accept them as they are. That's a great gift, and I think back that imagine if each of us had that sense of belonging and safety and acceptance throughout our childhoods. We would be much more functional and happy adults. Not that we're not functional and happy, but so I think that Maslow had those things right. Our need for safety and security, and then belonging early on in our lives is huge. So that's a great question, and I think a really important item to focus on, Bob. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, Reggie, I want to thank you. And to our audience, I just want to mention that we had an event that expresses Mercury retrograde at a high level, that the phone went out and we were disconnected. But, Reggie, I just want to thank you so much for mentioning your sister Anne-Marie. As you know, she was very dear to us. And right before the phone went out, I had just been thinking intuitively. I said, I had a sense. I said, Anne-Marie is here, and then the phone went out. So I don't know what that means, but I'm glad that we were able to get back to finish the call. And so I want to thank you for sharing with us, and I'm sure that you have helped many people in our audience. And so, Reggie, I want to thank you for your interview today and for being our featured guest. Would you just give us a close, Reggie, with what final thoughts or key idea would you like our audience to take away from today's broadcast?
Yeah, sure. Probably in any given moment, whether I'm feeling or you are feeling elated or sad, is just to take a breath and ask, what's really happening here, but really ask that question in a deep way, not in a superficial way, as we might ask about our political opponents or something like that. But what's really true in this moment, to the extent that I can get out of my story and what's really true, and ask that question, see what comes up, and then make my next decision, whether it's going to be being still or saying something or taking action, based on my best sense of what's really happening in this moment. And that's, I think, part of the healing process, is coming to terms with things as they are to the best of my ability in any given moment. So I'll leave you with that one.
Well, Reggie, this will be a first. Your answer is so great that I am going to actually change my clothes. That I believe it's so beautiful what you said, that the idea of being part of a group of people where you could either be goofy or grave and feel safe, accepted, and a sense of belonging. I think that, to use an old phrase, that's where it is at. And so I'll close for our audience and thank Reggie Marra for giving us safety, acceptance, and a sense of belonging. And I want to thank our audience for listening, wherever you are, in whatever time zone you are in. We welcome and look forward to your comments about our show. Please contact us through our website with your feedback and suggestions. Remember, listeners, if you'd like to experience the same benefits our coaching clients get with us and learn how to get control of your schedule or easy ways to dissolve your chronic pain, stress, or anxiety, feel free to call us at 954-900-2179. Mention that you heard our Stress Free Now podcast show, and your first session is absolutely free. Call today to schedule your appointment. For Christine Wright, this is Dr. Robert Wright, Jr. of www.stressfreenow.info. Until next time, be safe and be well.